Our speaker tonight is one of those rare and wonderful individuals who manages to combine meticulous research with spellbinding storytelling, and these skills have made him one of America's greatest and popular historians. Nathaniel Philbrick is the author of Mayflower, a story of courage, community, and war, which was a finalist for both the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for History and the Los Angeles Times Book Award, and won the Massachusetts Book Award for nonfiction. Philbrick is also the author of the acclaimed international bestseller In the Heart of the Sea, which won the National Book Award for nonfiction. Among the other books he has written are The Last Stand, Sea of Glory, The Epic South Seas Expedition 1838-42, Revenge of the Whale, An Account of the Essex Disaster for Young Readers, and The Mayflower and the Pilgrim's New World, the story of Plymouth Colony for young readers. Please join me in welcoming back Nathaniel Philbrick.
Thank you, Jim. It is a true pleasure to come back to the American Antiquarian Society. You know, this is the institution that Isaiah Thomas built with a little help from Esther Forbes. And I have to say that one of the reasons I decided to write this book, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and in 5th grade, I was assigned John Tremaine. And like many people of my generation, that book had an indelible impact to the sense that a kid just like me could be caught up in historical events, that, you know, the events did not just live with dust and dates, that this was alive, really inspired me. And it was in the summer of 1984 when my wife and I moved to Boston full-time with our young daughter, Jenny, who was just under 2 years old. We rented an apartment on Prince Street in the North End. And I was at that time a sailing journalist, but my primary responsibility was taking care of Jenny. So I spent much of that summer pushing the stroller through the crooked streets of the North End. And it was there that I began to think about, what was this place like back in the day of Johnny Tremaine? And so when Melissa was home on the weekends, on Sundays, I began a routine whereby I would go to the Boston Public Library and begin to research the history of Boston. Particularly, well, I was fascinated by the topography, because we all know, if you drive into Boston now, what you encounter is a seemingly limitless urban sprawl, you know, punctuated by high-rises. But you get very little sense of what Boston was like in 1775. At that time, Boston was virtually an island, a 1.2 square mile island with a thin neck of land connecting it to Roxbury. If you come in on Washington Avenue, you are following what was the neck into Boston. And there was a population of 15,000, and the island was dominated by 3 very large hills. With you know, the Beacon Hill we see today is just a diminished presence of what it once was. And these hills dominated Boston. And the community was huddled in the shadow of these hills, in what was the north and south end. It was almost medieval in that the streets, as we all know to this day, make no sense. In part, that's because cows showed the way as they tried to negotiate these hills and did a diagonal as they came down. And those were eventually codified in the streets, and we are all suffering the consequences because of that. The Back Bay was exactly that, a back bay. It was water. I was walking into, we have an apartment in the South End. I was born in Boston, at Brigham's. And walking into Boston just the other day, I noticed, there's a tea stop, South Cove. Why is it called South Cove? It's Tufts Medical Center. Well, if you look at the maps, and I have to say, maps are tremendously important to my research process. It was, the British, when they were stationed in Boston, did an incredible job of mapping the terrain. And what you see is that there was a South Cove off the Neponset River, which spread out much more than it does now. And right there was water. So Boston was this very isolated outpost. in a harbor full of islands. And if you've ever flown in and out of Boston, you see essentially the same scape that the British and New Englanders knew so well. And, you know, I have kind of a maritime background, even though I grew up in the maritime capital of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I've always been interested in books about the sea, and it was fascinating. And this, I have to say, Bunker Hill, this book for me was full of surprises. And one of them was how much of a naval battle surrounded the siege of Boston. It became, the English had the men of war and other ships that controlled the harbor and the entrance to the harbor. But it was the Patriots in whaleboats, many of them confiscated from my hometown of Nantucket, which was a loyalist enclave. In whaleboats, they were literally running circles around these ponderous men of war as they were in a race for resources on these islands that were sources of hay, sheep, and those kinds of grazing animals. And so you saw this cat and mouse game going on. And there was one Benjamin Tupper who led a fleet of 40 whaleboats on not one but 2 attacks on the lighthouse at the Little Brewster there at the mouth of Boston Harbor, and burned it down twice. And it was just infuriating to the British to have this kind of thing. So this was going on. But Boston itself was this island, which meant that when it was surrounded during the siege of Boston by the Patriots, it was cut off from the land routes around it. It was only those naval vessels that allowed foodstuffs to keep coming in after Lexington conquered and began the siege of Boston. And so it was after Mayflower, which ends with King Philip's War, largely fought in this area, that I began to realize I wanted to continue the story, so to speak, and take up exactly 100 years after the end of King Philip's War, because it was becoming clear to me there was a lot of unfinished business in the 17th century that would be enacted in the Revolution. And what I'd like to do before I continue on is to read how this book begins, because for me, the preface is where I crystallize my voice, my approach, what the book is about. It's the first thing I write, and often it takes me, I would guess, 2,000 drafts before, and I come in at it many different ways until finally I feel like I've got something. And I'd like to read you now how Bunker Hill begins. On a hot, almost windless afternoon in June, a 7-year-old boy stood beside his mother and looked out across the green islands of Boston Harbor. To the northwest, sheets of fire and smoke rose up from the base of a distant hill. Even though the fighting was at least 10 miles away, the concussion of the great guns burst like bubbles across his tear-streaked face. At that moment, John Adams, the boy's father, was more than 300 miles to the south at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Years later, the elder Adams claimed that the American Revolution had started not with the Boston Massacre or the Tea Party, or the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord and all the rest, but had been effected before the war commenced in the minds and hearts of the people. For his son, however, the decisive day, a phrase used by the boy's mother, Abigail, was June 17, 1775. 71 years after that day, in the jittery script, an old man, John Quincy Adams, described the terrifying afternoon when he and his mother watched the battle from a hill beside their home in Braintree. I saw with my own eyes those fires, and heard Britannia's thunders in the Battle of Bunker's Hill, and witnessed the tears of my mother, and mingled with them my own. They feared, he recounted, that the British troops might at any moment march out of Boston and butcher them in cold blood, or take them as hostages and drag them back into the besieged city. What he remembered most about the battle was the hopeless sense of sorrow that he and his mother felt when they learned that their family physician, Dr. Joseph Warren, had been killed. Warren had saved John Quincy Adams' badly fractured forefinger from amputation, and the death of this beloved physician was a terrible blow to a boy whose father's mounting responsibilities required that he spend months away from home. Even after John Quincy Adams had grown into adulthood to become a public figure, there refused to attend all anniversary celebrations of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so that's how the book begins. And for me, what I was trying to get across was the fact that the revolution, John Adams saw the revolution quite rightly in how the people's mindset changed even before the events, the more violent events occurred. But for many, and I think we have a tendency in this country to see it in those terms. Our own revolution is less a thing of violence and more a thing of ideology or a way of life, looking into the future. The reality of it was that I grew up thinking it was Patriots versus British. That was it, good versus evil. But what I came to discover in a very visceral way as I researched this book is ambivalence has been written out of the history of our country. It wasn't that cut and dry. Many people were loyalists, we would call them, who treasured their ties to Great Britain, many of them merchants, and that's where their money came from. The revolution, people who would become revolutionaries, who for lack of a better word I call patriots, saw things differently, saw that their forefathers, many of them Puritans, had come in the 1600s to get away from England so that they could worship as they wanted. They wanted a form of autonomy. And one of the things that had moved me while I was working on Mayflower was to discover in 1676, in the midst of King Philip's War, the governor of Massachusetts says to an agent of the crown that the king can give us more liberties, but don't you understand that Parliament basically has no sway over our own government? What he was saying was exactly what the Patriots would be saying 100 years earlier. There is a deep history to the Revolution, and it goes back to people in the country towns surrounding Boston who saw this conflict less as a philosophical discussion of natural rights and Parliament's sway over us, as they were defending what their forefathers had died doing in the French and Indian Wars and King Philip's War, and they saw it in very black and white terms. This was their battle of freedom. And what they had that the British really didn't take into account was that each one of these towns, ever since their founding in the 17th century, had a militia equipped with muskets that would train. And each town had an ancient tradition of defending themselves, of going out there. And this didn't exist in Scotland, in Ireland, where Britain had successfully suppressed other rebellions. It was going to be different in Massachusetts and New England. And that only gradually became obvious to those across the Atlantic. The Atlantic is a huge character in this book. When relations between the colonies and the British ministry started to go downhill, it was almost inevitable that it would continue to go from bad to worse, because it took a month for a ship to cross the Atlantic. It took about another month for anyone to figure out how they were going to respond to the latest event. Then it took another month to get the word back, and by that time, events had inevitably changed. And so it was just a natural course that events would begin to spin wildly out of control. And what began as an attempt to get more rights would eventually become a war of independence. And so you had the two poles of people pulling at one another. But in the early 1770s, most people didn't know what they believed. They wanted things to stay the way it had always been. They liked being a part of England. Even radicals like Samuel Adams referred to England as home. No one said that independence was their goal. And in fact, even after the Battle of Bunker Hill, even after Lexington was conquered, the Patriot forces claimed allegiance to King George. Their problem was with Parliament and the British ministry. They called the Redcoats the ministerial soldiers. They bravely flew the British flag and said it was King George, that they knew that he was really in their camp. It wasn't the case at all. The fact of the matter is, there was a logical fallacy at the heart, initially, of the Patriot movement. What they wanted was more autonomy. And if you took that to its natural end, that meant independence. But that was not in anyone's vocabulary at this point. And as is often the case, when people are pushing for something that they don't admit is really what they're pushing for, there's a lot of ambivalence, even among the Patriot radicals. John Adams would have a mental breakdown soon after the Boston Massacre, had to take time off from work, go on a sabbatical, so to speak. Samuel Cooper, who was the minister of the Brattle Street meeting, which was the most well-off congregational meeting in Boston, was a foremost patriot, corresponded regularly with Benjamin Franklin. He would suffer bouts of depression that would leave him in bed for months at a time. This was hard for everyone involved. No one saw independence in the future. No one wanted independence in the future. And what ended up driving this was the fact that after the Boston Tea Party, when 3 shiploads of tea were famously thrown into Boston Harbor, and by the way, the tide was out that night when they threw the tea into the harbor. So they throw it out and it goes on the mud flats. And so they sent out boys to start pushing it away, and then the tide came up. Finally, it all floated out there. And that's what I love about history. It was never quite as clean and decisive as you would like to think. But what happened after that was essentially Britain overreacted. It said, how dare they? What we will pass is the Boston Port Act, which essentially shut down the port of Boston. And no goods were allowed to come in. If they came in, they had to come via Salem, Plymouth. They had to then be carted in, and some of the merchants said that the overland transportation was as expensive as bringing it across the Atlantic. And so this was not a viable way to go. And poor Thomas Gage, I ended up having a lot of sympathy for the British perspective in this. This became a war that no British officer relished. No one wanted to fight against subjects of the crown. It would become the graveyard for many British military careers. No one liked this battle, and it was infuriating. Like armies of occupation of today quickly have discovered, it's very hard to be in a city where the residents do not want you there. And that's what Thomas Gage discovered. Thomas Gage was part of all of this. He was made commander of the military and royal governor. And he arrived in May of 1774 to institute the Boston Port Act. And along with 4 regiments of British regulars, as we call them. And suddenly, Boston was getting flashbacks to what had created the Boston Massacre. It was becoming a city occupied militarily. Now, Gage might have had a shot at instituting the Port Act if the British government had left it at that. Benjamin Franklin, soon after hearing the Tea Party, had proposed that why don't you do the natural thing? Pay for the tea. It's been estimated that tea in modern dollars to do that would have cost somewhere in the vicinity of $800,000. And there are merchants throughout Boston who are willing to put up the money. Let's just pay for it and move on. But that's not what the Patriots wanted. They wanted to make this an issue that they could push as hard as they could. And the British then added fuel to the fire by passing the Massachusetts Government Act. And this turned out to be Thomas Gage's worst nightmare. What the government was doing was basically stripping Massachusetts of its long-held British liberties. It was many of the public officials that had been elected were now appointed by the king. And these hated, and no one could stand for this. The lifeblood of the Patriot movement had been the town meeting. Boston was one of about 250 towns in Massachusetts. And remember, at this time, Massachusetts included modern Maine. And it had been Samuel Adams who, at the fall of 1772, 2 years after the massacre, had come up with a brilliant plan. At this point, the Patriot movement was languishing. It was losing all its momentum. It was in that fall that he created the 21-member Boston Committee of Correspondence, whereby they would send out open letters discussing the political issues of the time from Boston to every town throughout Massachusetts. And so the town meetings that had informally discussed things like road improvement and building bridges became forums for the issues of the day. What he was creating was an independent form of communication outside the government-controlled ways of communicating. He was turning each town meeting into a chat room where people were talking about what was going on. And the responses they began to get were truly amazing. Where in towns in what we call Maine today, where they had been attacked by, undergone Indian attacks, and as recently as 16 years before, where townspeople had been killed and captured, they get these addresses and they say, we know little of Parliament, but we do know how to defend our property. We have fought for what we have. Our wives are used to making cartridges and bullets while we defend our lands. We know what it is like to defend our way of life. We are there, and it was clear that this Patriot movement, if it ever came to blows, knew where its potential fighters were going to come from. And that was Adams and the others began to realize that the real radicals were not necessarily in Boston. They were out there in the country towns. The Massachusetts Government Act is instituted in August of 1774. Massachusetts goes wild. In town after town, royal officials find themselves the victims of gangs and crowds, and they have to hightail it out, and they flee to Boston, which now becomes increasingly a city under siege. There is, in early September 74, the powder alarm. And this quickly became that what the colonists realized was they didn't know how to make gunpowder in America at this time. Very little of it was made. Actually, almost all of it came from Britain. And if this came down to war, they were going to need every granule of powder they could find. And so by September, it was becoming a race between Thomas Gage and the colonists for gunpowder. And Gage, there was a royal, and each town had its legal supply of gunpowder. And the one thing about Gage, there was not martial law at this point, and it was infuriating for him. Even as all of this was going on, dozens of weapons, including cannons, were leaving Boston and going out to those country towns as he was trying to control it. It was infuriating, but he respected their British liberties. The Patriots had a very different attitude. When it came to loyalists, they were often brutally suppressed, and this was going on at towns throughout Massachusetts. Worcester was a true center of Patriot defiance. You could say that the streamlining of the militia into the force that would make all of this possible happened here. This was really where it was happening. And so there were in early September, Gage sent out at early morning hours a group of soldiers to take the powder out of the powder house in modern-day Somerville. The operation went without a hitch. They were rowed up the Mystic River, they marched in, they got the gunpowder, they took it back to the boats, and they delivered it to Castle William. The Castle Island is no longer an island, but it's still there. And by early morning hours, it had been a successful operation. But it had created a rumor that while the British were getting the powder, some militiamen opposed them. Shots were fired, and several militiamen had fallen and been killed. It hadn't happened, but this was the rumor. And it spread from town to town to town to town. By that night, all of Massachusetts, within a 50-mile radius of Boston, was sending in its militiamen, streaming in. This is September 74. By the next morning, thousands of militiamen had gathered in Cambridge. It was clear that the rumor was wrong, but they congregated there, and they were a crowd, a dangerous and volatile group. By this point, Massachusetts had lost many of its leaders to the First Continental Congress. John Adams, Sam Adams, other Patriot leaders were on their way to Philadelphia. The de facto leader of the Patriot movement was a 33-year-old doctor named Joseph Warren. And the cry came out from Cambridge, we need help, from the Committee of Correspondence. An entirely different role. Instead of writing letters, we need them to calm people down, to make some order out of this. And so Joseph Warren and a fellow group of members of the committee took the ferry to Charlestown and went into this group and did their best to calm things down. I'd now like to read a section from the book describing Joseph Warren. He was a very different kind of leader. He was a reader too, but I have to say, it is just so cool to be back here where the librarians are. I mean, it's like being given the keys to the candy store or whatever. But, and so I'd like to read a brief description of Warren at the time when he is called in. You know, he is now just entering the stage and just becoming the most visible person on the ground revolution. He's not giving speeches at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He is there organizing things. Whereas Samuel Adams was part political boss, part ideologue, Warren, just 2 decades younger, close to 2 decades younger, possessed a swashbuckling personal magnetism. He'd been born in the nearby town of Roxbury, just across from Boston Neck. And as a boy, he was often seen wandering the streets of Boston, selling milk from the family farm. The eldest of 4 brothers, Warren was recognized as an unusually gifted boy. And when he was 14, he began his studies at Harvard. In the fall of that year, his father was picking apples from the top of a tall ladder when he fell and broke his neck. Warren's youngest brother, John, had been just 2 years old at the time. And by the way, John was destined to begin that little institution known as Mass General. John had been just 2 years old at the time of this tragic event, and one of his first memories was watching his father's lifeless body being carried away. With the financial help of family friends, Warren was able to continue at Harvard and later served as a kind of surrogate parent for his brothers, particularly for John, who had recently finished his medical apprenticeship with Warren and was now a doctor in Salem. At Harvard, Warren's talent for pursuing a dizzying variety of extracurricular activities was soon evident. Early on, he staged several performances of the popular politically themed play Cato in his dorm room. The French and Indian War was then in full swing, and he joined the college's militia company. A classmate later told the story of how Warren responded to being locked out of a meeting of fellow students in an upper-story dormitory room. Instead of pounding at the door, he made his way to the building's roof, shimmied down a rain spout, and climbed in through an open window. Just as he was making his entrance, the rotted spout collapsed to the ground with a spectacular crash. Warren simply shrugged and commented that the spout had served its purpose. For a boy who had lost his father to a fatal fall, it was an illustrative bit of bravado. This was a young man who dared to do what should have, by all rights, terrified him. Joseph Warren was an extraordinary leader. One of his contemporaries described him as one of those people who can speak with someone who disagrees with him, talk with him earnestly, and by the end of it, that person agrees with him and thinks it was all his own idea. We all sort of know those kinds of people. Warren was energetic, eloquent, charismatic. He was also a grand master of the St. Andrew's Masonic Lodge stationed at the Green Dragon Tavern. And that was really the nerve center of the Patriot movement. He was a leading doctor in Boston. And he would, as tensions began to build, he would emerge as the leader. Ever since the Boston Massacre, they had an annual Massacre Day oration at the Old South meeting. And it should have been March 5th, but that was a Sunday, so they made it March 6th in 1775. It was an electric gathering. Remember, by this point, thousands of British soldiers were in the streets. Violence was erupting in streets everywhere where soldiers and citizens would go at each other. And everyone was anticipating this oration because it was sure to ignite some kind of something. And so an estimated 5,000 people were in the Old South meeting. It was a warm March day, 55 degrees, and Warren was scheduled to give the oration. It was packed, even more crowded than now. And 40 British officers were there. Sam Adams, who was the stage manager of all this, who made sure to bring those officers up front because he said it's always better to have your enemy close in times like this. There were even soldiers sitting on the steps up to the pulpit. Warren and a servant come down, what's now Washington, and go into a pharmacy that was across the street, where he gets dressed into a Roman toga. Remember, he had performed Cato in his dorm room. They take him, he can't get in the building, it's so choked with people. And a British officer would write in his diary that every man had a cudgel or some other object in his hand. Everyone was spoiling for a fight. Warren comes, they put a ladder up the back window. He comes up the ladder, sort of like his entrance at the dorm room. And he comes in and goes to the pulpit, which is draped in black, and he begins his oration. Everyone is waiting for something to happen. But the oration that could have been, in your face to the British soldiers there was remarkably restrained and wonderfully eloquent. It's just great. And in the midst of it, and he's there dressed, in the toga. Apparently he had, in his right hand was a handkerchief, his left hand was in his pocket as he spoke. And at one point there was a cat from the Welsh Fusiliers sitting right in front of him, in front of the pulpit. And in the midst of his speech, the officer puts out his hand filled with lead musket balls. Warren, without missing a beat, drops his handkerchief on the hand and continues on. They get through the speech, and everybody's then waiting for something to happen. It breaks up. It's a little confused at the end when there are British soldiers going by who've been on maneuvers, and they hear fifes and the British officers. When Sam Adams comes up at the end and praises Warren's speech, talks about the horrible massacre, and they all go, "Fie, fie, fie." Everyone in New England, that's how they say fire. People panic. They begin to flee the building, jumping out windows, doors, but it wasn't a fire. People calmed down, but it was clear this was a city on the edge. I'm not going to go in detail about Lexington and Concord. You're going to have to read the book to get to that kind of thing. But Lexington, Warren would be the one. Warren was the last Patriot leader in Boston on April 18th. He was the one who gave Paul Revere the orders to alert the countryside that the British were headed to Concord. The next morning, he learned that what had happened in Lexington. He made his way across the Charles River in a boat. After a quick meeting of the Committee of Safety, which was effectively the executive branch of the provincial government, he joined the fighting. He made his way to Lexington and was there side by side with General Heath as they were involved in the fighting, as they tagged, they followed the British regulars as they retreated back to Charlestown and eventually Boston. He was so in the fighting that by one account it was in what we now call Arlington, where he was in musket ball, took out the pin, which held, he was a very stylish dresser. And he had horizontal curls that were the fashion of the day. And the musket ball took out the pin, and it became, like the story everyone told. Warren proved that he was a leader who had no fear of putting himself in harm's way. After Lexington conquered, Boston becomes a city besieged. People, the patriot inhabitants of Boston panic. They got to get out of here. And so people are streaming out of the city. Meanwhile, all those militiamen streamed to Cambridge and Roxbury, and Boston is now a city surrounded. Warren is elected president of the provincial Congress. He is the effective head of the Committee of Safety, which means he is the head of both the legislative and executive branches of the government. Samuel Adams, John Hancock are in Philadelphia at this point. Warren is the one who is putting together this ragtag band of militiamen into an army. By June, he has been appointed a major general because he had decided that if this becomes a war, he wanted to be there on the field. He was highly ambitious, and that loyalists used that, said that this was a personal ploy to increase his fortunes. But Warren was a man, it's incredible. The letters he was writing to Samuel Adams when he's in the midst of this chaos are discussing what form of government we could ultimately have. He says the problem we've had with the British is that royal governors, to get ahead, want to get preferments from the crown. They don't want to do what's best for the people. Any future government, if you're in order to advance, you have to go through the people. He's describing what will ultimately be, we the people. He is there at Bunker Hill. Once again, I am not going to go into the details of that battle. You'll have to read them. Let's just say it was one of the most spectacular and terrifying spectator events ever. This was a battle fought in Charlestown, where 2,000 British soldiers met equivalent, if not more, provincial soldiers right there on a green hill that was actually Breed's Hill, rather than Bunker Hill. And the citizens of Boston were still there, watched from the roofs of the buildings. It was all happening right there. The British General John Burgoyne, who was on Copp's Hill in Boston as this happened, he described the tension they all felt when they realized that this battle could very well determine the fate of the English-speaking world. The British would win after 3 traumatic charges. They would take the redoubt, and Joseph Warren would be killed, and his life snuffed out. And it was an absolute devastation to the people of Massachusetts and New England. We don't know about him today because he did not live to become one of the founding fathers we all talk about. He didn't have time in his life to write a lot of letters. And so he didn't have the paper trail that historians require to really bring something to life. But what he does have is tremendously eloquent and important. And so he became a real focal point for me in this book. And what made it even better was with the exit of Warren arrived one of the other great historical figures of our time, George Washington. Can you imagine this planter from Virginia suddenly finds himself surrounded by thousands of Yankee militiamen, dirty, undisciplined. These guys have grown up in town meetings where every decision is made through consensus. They don't like taking orders, particularly from an officer. And this is infuriating to someone who's trying to instill some discipline into this army. Washington, it would turn into a siege of almost a year. Washington was very different from the stoic icon that stares at us from the dollar bill. He was in his 40s. He wanted to do something. He wanted to attack Boston. Fortunately, they didn't have enough powder. They didn't have the manpower or the weapons. If they had attacked, they would probably burn Boston and very well might have lost his army. But Congress had insisted that the Council of War be consulted before any decisions were made. And every time Washington proposed an attack, the Council of War would overrule him. Washington may have known that dynamic and just injected some tension into it. But finally, in one of the great stories of all time, a bookseller by the name of Henry Knox would go up to Fort Ticonderoga in the winter and bring back tons of cannons that once they were in a miraculous nighttime operation, once they were mounted on 2 forts on Dorchester Heights, and I recommend if you haven't gone to Dorchester Heights, go there. It's changed immensely around there, but it's still a commanding height that gives you a sense of the tactical advantage they enjoyed there. And thus they made it clear that the British had no choice but to evacuate. Evacuation day was April 17th, St. Patrick's Day. What? March, sorry. March. Again, you know, it's really hard. Between Lexington and Concord, I mean, I got a lot of dates, and I'm never very good with those dates. So thank you, March 17th. And with that evacuation fleet, there'd be a fleet of about 150 vessels. No one had seen a fleet like that before. There are close to 9,000 soldiers. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 loyalists would go, never to return again. Boston, in a way, had kind of reaffirmed its origins. Back in 1630, the Puritans had come to New England to do it their own way. And now, Bostonians had ejected a sizable portion of their own population who were on a different course, because soon to follow would be the Declaration of Independence. And where a rebellion was really a deeply conservative attempt to keep life the way it had always been. What they were objecting to was Britain's modern attempt to modernize its empire, to make its colonies pay for their upkeep. New England had never done that and was unwilling to do that in the future. And so it had begun as a conservative thing, but then with the Declaration of Independence, now they were fighting for something new. I end the book with Abigail Adams's description. She was there in Boston in late July when the Declaration of Independence was read on the balcony of the state, what is now called the State House at this point, because they're now states. And for me, that event takes the arc of the story from the building of tension to the release, and tells a story. If there's a hero of this book, the hero is the community of Boston. It really is. And I would like to end my comments tonight by quoting lines that were spoken by Reverend Samuel Cooper in the first sermon he delivered after the evacuation of the British soldiers. It was April 7th. Boston had been terribly beat up during this occupation. Old South meeting, you know, where they had done, Warren had delivered the oration, the pews had been torn up, they put down manure and turned it into a riding stable. The Green Dragon Tavern had been turned into a hospital. The Old North meeting had been burned to the ground as the British were running out of wood. They began to burn the old buildings. One of those being the parsonage of the Old South meeting, which had been built by John Winthrop, one of the first houses built on the island. They had been through a lot. You know, and Boston in the last few weeks has undergone its own trials. And I think all of us have watched this with this tragedy. It's just been a terrible time. And anything I've been proven to be in the 3 years of research and writing is that Boston is a community that has been resilient and will always be resilient. And I'd like to end with words from Reverend Cooper's sermon. Boston has been like a vision of Moses, a bush burning but not consumed. Thank you very much.